All right, my name is Wilkine Brutus. I'm the content director for Uji Wuji. Today I have
Sujatha Fernandes.
And can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I am a professor of sociology at Queens College in the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. And I've done research in Cuba and Venezuela. My focus is on hip-hop and social movements and mostly looking at them in a global sense.
Dale, pa' poder creer en ti. Está bueno ya de llorar con Marco Antonio Solí. Tú puedes ser grafitera, DJ, bigger MC. Si te inclinas por cantar, está bien bueno R&B. Spoken word, beatbox, tú puedes hacerlo, sí.
You've written extensively on hip-hop, on global social movements. What made you feel as though you could perhaps coalesce hip-hop culture with academia? What got you into doing that?
Well, I think it was my own experiences when I was growing up in Sydney, and I became involved in the hip-hop movement in Sydney. And actually, when I first became involved in the hip-hop movement, I thought I would never want to study it and never want to, because academia was always something that was so dry to me, and I thought hip-hop culture is so vibrant and alive and interesting, and I wouldn't want to make it boring by writing about it as an academic. And so I actually spent years doing other stuff before I went to Cuba. And when I was in Cuba and I learned about the hip-hop movement there, and I met people who were doing hip-hop, and I thought, wow, this is actually something that could be really cool, and it would be great to write about. And so it was that experience in Cuba where I saw not just how exciting the movement was, but just what an important role that it was playing in society by bringing up issues of race in a country where race had not been openly talked about or publicly talked about for many years. And it was through hip-hop that people were doing that. And that, to me, back in about 2000, which is when this was happening, was just fascinating and made me want to then, study
Pursue
hip-hop.
it more.
Yeah.
In hip-hop, you have MCing, DJing, breakdancing, graffiti, and knowledge. But it seems as though the general public seems to focus more on music. Why do you think the other elements are often ignored, but the music, there's more emphasis placed on music?
I think the reason that so much emphasis is placed on music is because of how easily commodified it is. And so while you had waves and hip-hop culture started going around the world, it was first the waves of b-boying, and then it was graffiti, and then it was rap music, and that was really the time of MTV Raps and other television programs that made a lot of money out of commodifying rap music and exporting it around the globe. And it was much harder to do something with, say, a piece of graffiti that is on a wall in the Bronx.
Very true.
Or, even though that's not past them, it has been done, but it's a lot harder to commodify something like a piece of graffiti or a dance or something that is more a sort of act or performance in the moment or something done in a particular local space. Whereas music and rap culture was something that could more easily be packaged for consumption and exported around the globe, and so there was a lot of money in it, and I think that was the fact why it became so, the sort of the most important part of hip-hop culture.
And easier to, I guess, translate and make it a global phenomenon, somewhat like books, and you read a book, some books are banned because of its impact.
Yes and no, right, because in some ways b-boying and graffiti were easier to translate because they didn't require language, and so you could have kids in, all over the globe, from Korea to Sydney to, Polynesian islands, watching breakdancing in movies or seeing a piece of graffiti, and it really spoke to them. It spoke to them on a level that they didn't have to understand the language. So actually language was a little bit of a barrier when rap music first started going around. It was in English, and countries that didn't speak English, where English wasn't spoken, it was somewhat hard. But again, one of the things that really helped with the spread of rap music was the music, and the music that spoke to people.
Very interesting you mentioned the barrier, because later on I'm going to discuss, or at least question you about the Black August Collective, because there's definitely some barriers there. But I want to go to a quote that you mentioned about Cuban hip-hop during an op-ed piece written for NACLA.org. Is it NACLA?
Yes, NACLA.
Okay, NACLA.org. You stated in response to the story about U.S. infiltration in Cuba, quote, Cuban hip-hoppers have built a multifaceted movement that raises issues of racism within Cuban society, provides a channel of expression for Afro-Cuban youth, makes connections with activists and celebrated artists around the globe, and has had a long-lasting impact on Cuban culture production. It was an organic movement built from the ground up, from the streets and the housing projects. Cuban rap is hope and anger and poetry, and no U.S. agency could create that, end quote. Whew. That's pretty direct about the infiltration. Is that movement in Cuba still alive today? Is it still relevant? That sort of hardcore political rap movement that isn't threatening to overthrow the government, just sort of highlighting the social ills of the modern day Cuban. Is that movement still relevant?
I would say it's relevant in a different way. It's not relevant in the way that it was, as I described in that quote, in the period of the 2000, in the period of 1998, 99, 2000, which is when it was really at its height, and which is when people were saying things through the lyrics. The rappers, the MCs were saying things that hadn't been said before in Cuban society, and they were creating shock, and they were creating huge followings. The annual rap festival was drawing thousands and thousands of youth to the concerts, and so Cuban rap had an impact and a relevancy then. It was also that it was a moment when Cuba was going through a real hardship, and there was no real voice for black youth, and so the music was taking on this really important role of expressing that voice. And so now I think it has a very different role, because so many rappers left after that wave of really intense kind of movement. Many rappers left and went to Europe, went to the UK, and not because necessarily because they felt that they'd had their movement co-opted, or not necessarily because they felt angry at the government or any of those reasons, mostly just because they wanted to experience something different, because they just wanted to get out of Cuba and see what the world was like outside, and because they couldn't pursue a career in their music.
Right, it wasn't going any further.
It wasn't going any further,
no
just
answers
in the country.
No solutions were coming out of it.
Yeah.
And then perhaps made it easier for reggaeton to take advantage of it. And
and so then we have this wave of reggaeton that comes, which really sort of in some ways intersects with, but takes a different path to the kind of, the conscious hardcore militant rap that was very much in vogue in about 2000. And so what you see is now, that the movement is much more dispersed. It's much more spread across the globe and diasporic.
And fragmented.
Yeah. But I would say it is still relevant to the point that rap musicians have found a way. Some of them are a lot older now. It's sort of a generation that, is getting older. Some of them have moved off into other things, into doing film, into, say, prison activism, or doing other things that were also not really thought about in Cuba prior to this period. And so I would say both politically, culturally, socially, rap has had a tremendous impact in Cuba and continues to have an impact on the music, so that the musical traditions in Cuba are now heavily influenced by that rap movement that started around the late 90s.
Wow, so